Okay, so our second model that we're going to look at is our incremental development model and delivery. And in this model, you're going to develop the system in increments, and then each increment gets evaluated before we proceed to the next increment. So by definition, using Agile, following the Agile values is incremental delivery. And that evaluation is not done by your team or yourself testing, but by the customer themselves. You can do this in two different ways. One would be planning in advance, dividing things into incremental deliveries, and that's how the managers like to do it because they like to have a plan. Or it can be as needed, where the highest priority requirements are delivered and each highest priority element is addressed, and we use that model when we use Agile development. So here's our picture for incremental development. We get an idea of what we want the software to do, and then we define some things and we develop those things and go back and forth and validate that our development is meeting the specification. And we keep going back and forth until we get our first initial version. And then that product continues to grow and evolve, giving more versions until we finally get to our final version. And when we get to a final version, we're actually probably near the end of life of our product, because if it's not evolving, then it probably isn't going to be used much anymore. The incremental deliveries are actually deployed to the end users, and that allows for the most realistic evaluation of the practical use. It's being used by the real users with real data, and that way they can actually give the best feedback as to what needs to be done for the next level. The difficult thing is that there's a lot of historical software out there that really could be replaced, really needs to be replaced, but it can be challenging to replace those systems with an incremental development and delivery option, because the company is reliant on that software. And if your increments are providing them less functionality than the system that's being replaced, they may not be able to function without all of that functionality. So sometimes it's not possible to do the incremental delivery, and sometimes, well, frequently, those legacy systems just keep living on and on because it is so difficult to replace them. So here's the graphic for the delivery. You can define the requirements, assign which requirements go in which increments, design the system, develop that increment, and then validate it and integrate it, test it, and deploy it until you get to your final system. The good thing about incremental delivery and incremental development is that the customer can get the functionality earlier. So they can get value out of using the system earlier, and they also can find problems with the system earlier, so that when you go to the next increment, you can incorporate that feedback into improving the system. Because you're generally going to put in the highest priority service, that highest priority service is going to have more testing and be more robust and more usable. And so that makes the product as a whole better. And because you're already planning to do increments, then it's more cost effective to accommodate those customer changes. Early increments can act as prototypes. Maybe they can't take the delivery to be using it because maybe it doesn't cover enough features yet, but they could take an early increment and use that as a prototype and get some, be able to get some feedback for it. And overall, if you have increments, you get better customer feedback, and then you have lower risk of overall project failure. Something that is a problem with your incremental development is that process isn't visible. Managers like to have regular deliverables. The programmer said it's going to take 10 days to do this feature, and the programmer tracks in, I'm 10% done, 50% done, and the managers have spreadsheets and they're shifting resources, and managers at big companies, that's what they do. And when you move to a more agile system where you're just grabbing the highest priority items and developing and fitting and changing as it grows and changes, then the manager is not able to really track as well where they are and how long it's going to take to get to a different point, because that's not defined. And so managers can sometimes have a harder time with the incremental and the agile because that is not visible in the process. The other thing that you have to be really careful when you're in a project that is using incremental development is that the structure, if you don't pay attention to your foundation, that infrastructure for your program, as you're tacking on new features and making new increments, if you don't put the time and money into that infrastructure and do refactoring as you need to, that structure is not going to be able to hold. It's like a house. If you built your house for just a roof and then you want to put a second story on it, your structure has not been built to support that extra weight, and it can be corrupt and all come crashing down. So if you are in an incremental development model, you have to be careful to make sure that you're investing in that infrastructure so that your software will be able to continue to grow and evolve and not become unmanageable. Some other problems, most systems require a basic set of facilities. And so if you're developing in increments, it can be harder to identify those common facilities, and you might need to refactor those out later to standardize and set up common facilities. So things like putting in different languages, globalization, those kind of things can use common facilities. And if you're just growing it as you go, some of those things are harder to identify, and then you'll have to spend the time to take those and refactor them. Also, with the iterative process, if you're working in a procurement model where you're trying to set up a contract and define the parameters of what's going to be delivered, how long it's going to take, and how much you're going to get paid, the incremental model does not work well with those definitions that are needed for a contract.